Okay, we are moving on to the second part of the skirt draft now. Hopefully this is easier to see without the sun shining in the window. Okay, so we had just finished off with the skirt front. We were not finished with it completely, so we still had some things to do to it. We still need to add seam allowances. Something that I've kind of sketched on this piece of paper already is that you want to make sure that you're adding seam allowances to the waist, which would be a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch normal, 1/4 inch to the actual princess line itself. At the hemline, we're adding, remember, we're doing 1 inch hems in real life, so we're gonna do a 1/2 inch hem to the base of this. So let's add a 1/2 inch to the hemline, so that it's a hem allowance. And then the center front doesn't require anything because it's gonna be placed on fold, which we've already indicated with the fold line. So make sure that you complete these drafts by adding seam allowances, adding the notches to those seam allowances. That seems to be something that a lot of people are missing. Make sure that you're notching. So whether you're using the notcher or whether you're creating that capital T shape, make sure that you're identifying the areas where there are seam allowances. One other area that you are going to want to notch is going to be the connection from the skirt front to the skirt side front. So what you'll do, and I'm just going to kind of roughly draw in a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. Once you tape this down and correctly draw in your seam allowance, you're going to want to add an additional notch at the HBL line, because what we'll do is we'll mimic that on the other side. So I'll kind of put one close over here. We're going to mimic that over here so that when you're sewing them, you know where the two connect, because there's not going to be this imaginary HBL line when it's in fabric. So again, notching all your seam allowances, creating all of your seam allowances. And then the last thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to label blank of blank, because we already did the other labeling in the last video. Once we finish up with the skirts, you'll be able to actually fill this out completely for this pattern set. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the side skirt. And what I've kind of already done is I've kind of already drawn some information here, but I'm just going to kind of backtrack a little bit. So if you look at my pieces together, how I started, you'll see that if I traced this here, sorry, trying to get it laid out there perfectly for you, you'll see that I did have an original shape over here that I kind of got rid of. And so what I did instead of tracing the entire shape of this skirt completely, what I opted to do was I just traced just the single dart leg of my second dart, the one that I'm not keeping. Remember, we keep this one here and we split our princess seam line on this dart because it matches with the bodice top, the dart placement or the dart area for the bodice top. So because we are splitting along that dart placement, we want to make sure that we match along the skirt so that it's one continuous line. So on this second dart, we don't have a drawing of a dart in that picture, so we don't want to keep it. We also don't need it, so we want to get rid of it. So the easiest way to remove it and to just not use it is to pivotal transfer that dart out. And so what you'll see here is I have it traced all along the sides. I have it traced all the way down to the bottom. And so I have that drawn here, and that's this initial outline. And then I have a couple videos close out on me, so I kind of did a little bit of work on it already, but I'm going to backtrack for you. So what I did here was I used the book, so I have the book up here and I'm looking at chapter 13, page 262, the pegged skirt with the pleats. And we talked about using this just to get the shape of that kind of narrow skirt hem. So we don't want it to flare, we want it to be a little bit more fitted. So imagine if this were the hip, it kind of tapers back down, and that's why it's called pegged, meaning it comes in a little bit. So if we look at the instructions from the book, it tells us to bring the side of the skirt in 1 full inch. We would do that half scale, so we would do 1/2 inch. If we do that, we still end up with quite a bit of a flare, and we really don't want that in our skirt. We want it to be, you know, pretty tapered. We want it to look like their illustration. So in order to achieve that look with the more fitted hemline, what you can do is you can actually go from the HBL line and you can create a perpendicular line from the hip down. So I'm drawing this line straight down. And what that does is that creates a more pegged or tighter fitted hem. And so that's the way that I've now created this side seam. And that's why I have these kind of slash lines here. I just am going to eliminate that extra flare that just naturally occurs when you do the pivotal transfer. So naturally, originally it would have been here, but again, we don't want that unintentional, because remember we pivotal transfer, so we pivotal boom. I gave myself that unintentional flare, so I don't want that, so I'm gonna remove that. And now I'm kind of ready to work with this piece of the skirt. What I like to do is I like to line my skirt front and my skirt side front up. And I want to make sure that my HBLs are still consistent, which they are. I also want to make sure that I have the hem lines matched up. So you can see here that I kind of drew with my darker marker a line to match up the hems, because I want my hems to be spot on when I go to sew this. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about this area of the dart here. So again, sorry, I'm kind of backtracking because I went through the video already and now I'm undoing what I already did. This was that initial dart. So let me kind of draw this back in for you so you could see. This is where we broke apart the two patterns, and this was my initial darted area. So I'm just going to kind of draw this back in for you. Okay, and so what I've done here is I've kind of circled this area and I've labeled it as a 1/4 inch. So if I take my ruler and I measure that area, I'm looking at a 1/4 inch of space here. Now there's a couple different ways that we can do this. What we can do is we can remove this 1/4 inch from the side to eliminate this excess, or we can simply eliminate this area and then reshape this side with a seam allowance. So it's kind of up to the way that you want it to fit. If we take that 1/4 inch away on the side over here, what it's gonna do is it's gonna give us a far greater shape in the hip area, which may not be something that you want, because that could end up causing kind of like a puckering out or like a bowing of the hip in this area, because you're removing so much from the waist. So what I think a better idea is to simply remove that 1/4 inch of the dart by just eliminating it. And so I'm going to use my scissors here just to kind of eliminate that dart excess. Get it out of the picture. And then what we can do is we can gradually kind of reshape this line. So we don't have to do it too dramatically, but I'm just gonna go ahead and I'm gonna tape this down to the paper, and I'm going to use my French curve to reshape very subtly that line. So, sorry, I'm getting my tape off here. Okay. I got a fairly large piece of tape. I'm just gonna go ahead and tape this down. Okay. Okay, and so now what you want to do is you want to take your curve of some sort. You can use your Variform or you can use your French. And you really just want to straighten out this line so you don't get a real abrupt kind of bend in the skirt here when you go to attach to the front. So I'm going to use kind of the very edge of my French curve here, and I'm going to just remove that little bit of that bowing of that skirt. So really it just kind of become this very narrow, sorry, mind that area there. It's gonna just continue down. I'm just eliminating that kind of triangular shape there. And then from this point, I'm going to add my seam allowances. So again, just like in the front, we're doing 1/4 inch along the actual princess style line itself, which which just so happens to be where my tape is lining up. And then this should be just a nice straight line from there. We're adding a 1/2 inch to the hem. So we kind of pivot that down a little bit. So we're gonna add a 1/2 inch to the hemline, which is gonna look a little funny because it's on quite a bit of an angle. But once we sew these together, then it'll reshape its way back. Okay, we're going to add 1/4 inch to those sides. Okay, adding. Okay, all the way. And this is exactly what you want to do on the skirt front too. I just didn't go through all the final steps of it. I'm just doing it on this one so you can kind of get an idea, because I'm going to cut it out of the paper and then I want to line it up to match my front. So I want one of them to be kind of finished. Okay, if you find that it's a little broken here, go ahead and use your French curve or your Variform. Use the subtle end of it and just go ahead and blend these lines so that they line up nice and smooth. And then use that to build your 1/4 inch seam allowance for the waist. Okay. Now something you want to remember, we talked about it over here, is that you're going to want to create a notch right on the HBL along the princess line. You're going to want to do that for the side front and also for the front. And actually, I don't know if I said that in this video. It may have been the video that stopped. So what I did is I just kind of faked it. I kind of faked a 1/4 inch seam allowance over here for the front. This would be taped down, 1/4 inch. And again, adding that notch to the HBL so that I know that these two get connected to each other along that line. Okay, so make sure that you're creating a notch on the HBL for the princess line. And then before we cut this out, what I want to do is I want to make sure that I am labeling it completely. So this is going to be 1/2 scale, cut 2 on grain, and then blank of blank. Okay, that's my skirt side front, my skirt front. So I'm almost done. The last thing I have to work with here are my backs. So I've already gone ahead and taken the liberty of tracing my skirt back. And I've labeled my HBL, so I have my HBL here. I have my single dart in my back because I've already started to eliminate it. So let me get out my skirt back for you so we can kind of look at these from the beginning. And I don't have my skirt back out. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna kind of draw out this back one here. Okay, so what we have in our initial drafts is we have 2 darts. So we have a single dart in the front and then we have another dart along the back. And what I've already done is I've already used the pivotal transfer technique to not only remove this second dart, but then I've also eliminated some of the bulk on the sides. So what I did with my back, and this is my front, but you would do it with your back piece, which has a larger dart. You can trace everything the same, but when it comes to the second dart, you're going to just draw the single leg and then transfer so that it reshapes the whole side. Essentially, this is the same thing that we did with the front, and now we're just doing it with the back piece. So you're gonna pivotal transfer out your second dart. The initial dart though, the first dart that's closer to the center, that is the dart that we've placed the princess lines on in the front. Again, pulling out the little illustration. So we want to continue the style line down in the back. So what you'll see here is that I've created a style line down from the dart point down to the hem of the skirt, and it's running perpendicular or parallel, I'm sorry, to the center back and perpendicular to the HBL. So again, just running down from that initial dart and making it parallel and perpendicular. Okay. So what that does is that then gives us a a skirt back, and it gives us our skirt side back. Okay. And again, you can go through the process of labeling these, half scale, half scale. This one, if we think about this back one when it comes to the cut of it, we can talk about that now before we continue our labeling. So what this one now would move on to would be the cut. And what we know from, again, looking at our illustration and thinking about it logically, and we've talked about this throughout the project, we need a zipper down the back of this dress. We can't do it with the place on fold. It would be too tight because it's so fitted. So what I need to do is I need to add an extension like I did to the top. Remember, we add a 1-inch extension full scale, so a half-inch extension half scale. And that gives me enough room to place my zipper in. So what I'll do from here is I'll go ahead and I will add in that half-inch extension to my center back. Okay, and then I know that I'm not going to be cutting 1 on fold, I'll be cutting 2 on grain, which means that I'll also have to draw in my grain lines. And that's something that, again, on all of these patterns, they should all have grains. So what I'll do, and I don't want to go through my labeling, so I'm going to move it to the side just a hair. What I want to make sure of is that I am drawing those lines completely through. I have it on my center front already, but I need to make sure that I go back to my skirt side front. And I need to make sure that I label that because I did not draw one in. So I want to make sure that I pull this one back out and illustrate that grain line that runs parallel to the center back. So I have that there. And then I know that I'm gonna need to draw it also on my skirt back. So these HBLs are really helpful because I can use the HBL because I know that it's perpendicular to the center front. So I'm using my HBL and I unintentionally ran through my labeling. So try not to do that just because it gets a little bit messy. So then I know here that I'll also be cutting 2 on grain. And I know that I need to label a blank of blank and here blank of blank. Okay. Now I can separate these two, just like I did for my fronts. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna go in and I'm going to carefully cut on that style line. And remember, we only have 1 dart now because we used the pivotal transfer to eliminate the second dart over here, which gave us this kind of funny shaped, kind of very dramatically shaped side, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Right now we're just gonna focus on the front. So I still need to add my 1/4 inch seam allowance up here, half scale. So I need a seam allowance up here. I've added my extension already for my center back, so I have that there, but I do still need to label my center back along this line. I also need to add that 1/2 inch hem depth. So remember, we're adding 1 inch total, 1/2 inch half scale. So I've got my 1/2 inch line. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure it's even. My 1/2 inch hem there. And I want to tape this down to paper, and I want to make sure that I add in I want to make sure that here I'm adding that 1/4 inch to the princess seam itself. Now at this point here where it kind of becomes a little abrupt, again, you want to pull out your French curve and you want to smooth that dart area before you add the seam allowance, just so it's a little more subtle. You're really just trying to eliminate that kind of pokey corner. So I've used my curve to remove that. And just like with the fronts, we want to make sure that once you add, so I'm going to kind of fake in this 1/4 inch seam allowance here. Once you have your seam allowance on your princess line, you're also going to want to add that notch to that HBL line. Again, so that can match to the notch that's going to occur over here eventually on the side. And that way we know they match together. Okay. One thing along the skirt back, which you're going to want to add, is you're going to want to add notches for the end of the zipper point. So we talked about having notches in the front already. So we talked about, and let's see if I have the piece right here to pull out, adding double notches to the center back here where the zipper starts, okay? And we know that we are going to need that zipper to go all the way through the waistline, and it's gonna have to go right to essentially the butt crack. It's the widest part of you, it's like the hip area. So you know that it needs to go to this point. So what we're going to do is we're gonna create 2 notches, and we're gonna start it on the HBL, and then we're gonna put one below the HBL a 1/4 inch away. And then this gives us that indication that the zipper starts, it's kind of hard to see, I'm sorry, because I know it's not in frame, but it starts all the way at the top here, and it goes all the way down to right above essentially the butt crack area, because that's the widest part of you. And so it goes right there to the HBL, and you have the ability to unzip this dress to get in and out of it. Okay, so that's our indicator for the notches there to stop the zipper. This will also help you to figure out what size zipper you're gonna need to make or use for this little project. Again, you don't need to place a zipper in it. You can just leave the seam allowances there, but you also will need to notify this on the pattern card. So you'll wanna make sure you know what kind of zipper to get. Okay. This one's almost done. This one again would need notches all the way around for seam allowances. You're gonna make sure you notch on the HBL. You're gonna wanna notch for the end of your zipper. Labeling, and then this one is essentially ready to go. We'll match it to the front in a minute, but we're gonna wait on that for just a second. Now we're moving on to our skirt back. So what we have here is, again, we use the pivotal transfer to get rid of this second dart that was here. We used it to remove it, but it does give us this very kind of strange, very pointed shaped side because of that pivotal transfer. So it actually goes quite a bit out and it goes over. So what we want to do is we want to eliminate this excess from the first dart, similar to the way that we did it on the front. So we could do it in 2 ways. We could do it where we measure this area here, which if I take my quilting ruler, it measures out to 1/2 inch. I could take that 1/2 inch like I've circled here, and I can eliminate it from the side. But if you look at what it does to my hip, again, it might give you that bowed hip where it looks like it's kind of protruding on the sides. It might be too much curvature for that area. So instead of doing that, what we can do is we can again eliminate that dart completely. And so I'm just actually gonna cut it off again so you can kind of see. We're gonna eliminate that dart completely. And then we're just going to gradually reshape this line here so it's not as dramatic and pointy. It's a little bit more subtle. Okay, and then this area I can add my seam allowance to. Now that's gonna keep this area within my pattern, so I'm just gonna go ahead and get rid of that line because we're actually going to keep it. We're not going to remove it in that way because it's going to shape it a little bit funny. And I'm sorry, these videos, I go through them and then sometimes they don't load correctly, and so I have to redo them, and I did a lot of work on this one already. So I'm going to eliminate from the actual princess area, leaving in the side area. But again, that gives me kind of this very funky, kind of really exaggerated flared hem, and like the front, we don't really want that. So again, what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna take my HBL, I'm gonna find the area on my hip where it lines up, and I'm just gonna draw this line directly down. Sorry, making sure it's still lined up. Directly down. And now I've given myself a much more fitted, pegged skirt look. Again, you want it to look similar to the illustration in the book. So now that I have this nice fitted waist area, I've got my nice fitted hem area. Now I can go ahead and I can start to attach my 1/2 inch hem allowance. I can tape this down to paper and add my 1/4 inch seam allowance on the princess line. I can add my 1/4 inch to the top. With my waist, I can add in my 1/4 inch on my sides, okay? I wanna make sure that I'm notching that HBL for the front. And I wanna make sure that I'm notching all of my seam allowances all around, including my hem depth, because I wanna know how deep that hem is. And then now what I want to do is, now that I'm essentially done with this front piece or this back piece, I want to take it to my front, and I want to make sure that they still match. So again, you would have seam allowances added. These would be cut out pretty and perfect. What you want to do is you want to take the two pieces, and hopefully your paper's kind of light enough for you to be able to see through, but you want to lay them on top of each other. And let me just kind of darken this line a little so I can see it through. You guys can also do this since you're using pencil. You can actually go ahead and take a marker now or Sharpie and darken it so that you can see through. It makes it easier for you. So I'm gonna line this up because this one doesn't have seam allowance on it. So I'm gonna line it up to the one that also does not have seam allowance. And I'm gonna make sure that they match. And it looks like they match really well, but that my back is a bit longer. So I'm going to go ahead and draw where my front ends, and this will be where I add my hem. So I am gonna make sure that these match perfectly, and if they don't, then I can redraw in my 1/2 inch seam allowance, or I'm sorry, hem depth for that hem there. Okay, I can redraw those lines, because these are the sides of the skirt, and you wanna make sure that when it's actually created, and I'm just gonna kind of quickly draw in the side seam here, you wanna make sure that they're straight, that one of them doesn't come out too low or that one of them doesn't come out too high. So you wanna make sure to achieve this perfectly matched side seam, you wanna lay them on top of each other and match them. That's something similar that we do to the fronts. In ours, in our side front and side back, it's not really that big of an issue on our drafts, only because we don't alter them. So we keep them the same. So if I'm looking at my side front bodice and my side back bodice, they match up, but we didn't alter them from the sloper. If you were to change, let's say like the armhole depth, you would definitely want to look at that. And that's again why I double check here with my skirts, because I did change something. Remember, I changed the overall shape of it. So you want to make sure that they still match. And that little bit of difference, that little bit that I had to take off of my side back, may have been just because of the curvature that I created on my side, okay? So making sure that those match, making sure that your, pieces are all labeled and notched and everything. Now the final thing that you can move on to is you can move on to finishing the number system. So I'm gonna pull out the kind of the submission sheet here. What we know is that we would work with the bodice fronts first. And the reason why we know that is because we've sewn before and we've taken intermediate sewing maybe, or we've taken beginning sewing, and we know that stay stitching is a thing. Stay stitching is something that you're gonna do when you do not have a collar, and we do not have a collar added to this neckline. So I would know that I would be stay stitching this front piece. So that kind of tells me straight away that this is gonna be my number 1, okay? Now, it depends on how you stay stitch and the way that you plan to do it, but your 1 piece is going to be the curved, let me see if I can pull out my pattern pieces here. It's gonna have the curvature of the neck, and the side front will not have that. Hopefully you guys, yeah, you guys do that. Hopefully, you realize that the neck only curves on the front, but not on the side front. So what that means then is that my stay stitching would then continue onto the back piece, so that this would be my number 2, my bodice back. Then I can assume that I would stitch my fronts to my front, so this would be my 3, and my back to my back, and this would be my 4. So those are my 4 pieces. But again, they're not exactly in this order. It's bodice front, 1, bodice back 2, bodice side front 3, bodice side back 4. So again, not exactly in the order that I have here on the paper. Then you can assume that you would move on to finishing the facings first before moving to the skirts, because again, we add interfacing early on in the construction of our projects. So if you think about a commercial pattern, you wouldn't necessarily move on to the skirt, you would move on to the neckline, completing the neckline and the armholes for the bodice before attaching that skirt as a full piece. So I would move on to, again, my facing pieces. And usually we would go to our front neckline facing as our piece 5, Then we would move on to our back as our 6, our armhole as our 7, and our back armhole as our 8, because we would complete the neck area first and then move on to our armhole second. Then we would move on to the skirt area, and with the skirts, this is where it's a little bit more straightforward, where we would probably work with the skirt front to the skirt side front and the back to the side back, because there's not a whole lot that's happening in the skirt area. So we're looking at 9, 10, 11, and then 12, okay? And then this is how you would label them on your pattern pieces of 12, of 12, of 12, of 12, and so on and so forth for the remaining pattern pieces. Okay. Now, once you complete this, this is when you can go to that pattern record card and you can label number 1, bodice front, number 2, bodice back, number 3, bodice side front, number 4, bodice side back, number 5, bodice front neckline facing, bodice, number 5, number 6, bodice back neckline facing, so on and so forth. So you don't want to fill out this area until you know that you've numbered them all correctly. And so it's kind of nice to be able to have something like this, or you can jot this down on a piece of paper, or I like to kind of just sketch it to look at it so I know what's coming next. So what I want from you guys when you submit this is I want pictures of every single pattern piece. And I know it's a lot of pattern pieces, and I know my tabletop's a little hectic here, but you're gonna have your, your skirt front, your skirt side front, your skirt back, your skirt side back. You're gonna have your bodice front, your bodice side. So you should have 12 pieces, and they should all be completely done, notched. Make sure that you're notching your notched areas, notching your seam allowances, notching where they match, notching the bottoms. Make sure that they're labeled properly. Make sure that there's grain lines on every single piece. Make sure that when you get to the skirts that you have a hem depth. That's obviously, acceptable for what the pattern looks like. We're doing full inch, or 1 inch full scale, and we're doing ½ inch for our little pattern pieces. I want you guys to photograph each of those 12 pieces so that I can see them. Again, every single piece, that includes those little tiny facing pieces. And then I want you to photograph the cost sheet. So taking a photograph of the cost sheet that we went over in the previous videos, and the pattern record card. I want a photograph of all of those. Those are going to be required for the princess seam dress, and then also for your dress project. So we went over the dress project a little bit, and we'll go over it more in the next week's lecture, but that's going to involve all of the same requirements, photographing every pattern piece that's involved, and then the pattern cards and record cards also. Okay, so hopefully that is the complete set for you guys.